Hello, class. This is Mr. Hart, and in this podcast, we want to finish up the plate tectonics chapter and the story of plate tectonics with actually looking at plate tectonic theory. So, last time we talked about seafloor spreading, which is kind of the next thing after a continental drift. Okay, continental drift happened in the 1910s. Seafloor spreading happened in the 1950s. Doesn't take very long after for the theory of plate tectonics to come around. Only about 10 years in the 1960s. Okay. And so what plate tectonics is it's very similar to seafloor spreading, except they realize that this movement isn't just happening along the mid-Atlantic ridge. They realize that this is happening in many different areas, and it can be described by looking at different plates. Okay, so this picture right here shows all the different plates around the Earth. There's about 14 in total. Okay, and you can kind of see inside the plates is there the different continents. Okay, so sometimes people have this idea that the continental plates are just the continents themselves. That's not the case. It can include a lot more area than just the continent itself. But we have these different plates, okay, in these different areas, okay, that are all moving very, very slowly. And so how we were able to figure out where these plates were was, again, by analyzing earthquake data. Okay, similar to what Marie Tharp and Bruce Heason did, they looked at the different points where earthquakes were happening, the epicenters, and they found this one, but later on they were able to realize that these plate boundaries could also be traced by looking at the epicenters. Okay, so for example, look at this one around Africa. You kind of see how there's this outline of epicenters around Africa. Well, if you look at Africa's plate over here, it's approximately the same shape. Okay, let's look at the Middle Eastern plate. So the Middle Eastern plate kind of just surrounds the Middle East. Again, if you look at the Middle Eastern plate, it kind of surrounds the Middle East, and so on and so forth. You could do this with South America and all the other plates. Okay, South America is right here. If you look at the South American plate, very similar in shape. Okay, so this is how they were able to figure out where the different plates were by analyzing this earthquake data, looking at the epicenters. Okay, so this is where we get the plate boundaries from. Okay, and so very similar to seafloor spreading, okay, the mechanism for the plates to be moving happens from convection. Okay, so not just from the magma coming up and splitting it like in seafloor spreading, but it comes also from these convection cells. Okay, so just probably like you learned in grade school, hot air rises and cold air sinks. Well, hot magma rises and cold magma sinks as well. Okay, so outer core is going to be very hot, right? And the lithosphere is going to be relatively cold compared to it. And so this outer core heats up the lower material in the mantle, and that makes that rise, while the lithosphere causes this material to cool down and sink to the bottom of the mantle, okay? And so we get these convection cells. And so they don't move the plates on top of them a whole bunch, but over time, consistently, this convection cells flowing is what causes the plates to move. Okay, this is one reason it's so important to understand the different parts of the mantle. We have the lithosphere, we have the asthenosphere, and we have the mesosphere. The lithosphere is the main part that cools this magma, okay, and where the plates reside is on the lithosphere. This is where we're going to get most of the cooling effect occurring, and this is what's actually going to be moving, the lithosphere. The asthenosphere is responsible for, it's right under the lithosphere, and that's responsible for doing that slight movement. It's what causes that lithospheric plate to move slowly over time, is because the asthenosphere is not solid. It's a putty-like material, so that it can slowly move across the asthenosphere. And then the mesosphere is responsible for transferring this heat like it's shown in this picture. Okay, that's why it's so important to understand these different layers. Okay, like we talked about at the beginning of the chapter, because they serve different purposes, especially with plate tectonics. Okay, but this is the general idea. This convection cell occurring slowly over time is what can cause these plates to move. Okay, so we will understand the different types of plate boundaries, or how these plates can interact with each other. Okay, and you may have learned this in a geography class before. Okay, but let's get a little bit deeper into them. So we can have three types of plate boundaries: convergent, divergent, and transform. And then among the convergent boundaries, you can also have three: oceanic, continental, oceanic, oceanic, and continental, continental. Okay? Let's start with convergent boundaries. So convergent, as you can imagine, the word converge means to come together, right? And so convergent plate boundaries, when two plates are hitting into each other, they're coming together. They're usually associated with large mountain ranges or volcanoes, okay? So we have three different types because we have two different types of plates, okay? So we can have an oceanic plate collide with a continental plate. We can have an oceanic plate collide with an oceanic plate, and we can have a continental plate collide with a continental plate. Let's look at what happens to each of these individually, okay? So if you have an oceanic continental plate collision, okay, then what's going to happen is the oceanic plate is actually more dense. It's thicker than the continental plate. And so what it's going to do is when it collides with that continental plate, it's actually going to sink underneath that plate, okay? It's going to subduct like we saw with seafloor spreading. Okay, and when that happens, that material gets heated in the asthenosphere and starts to melt, and that causes magma and gas and hot material to rise to the surface, which causes large volcanoes. Okay, this picture over here is a picture of South America, and if you know the geography of South America, you know there's a large volcanic mountain range along this left side. Okay, so this whole left side is a plate boundary between the continental plate of South America and the oceanic plate of the Pacific Ocean. And so they're slowly colliding, and that Pacific plate is sinking underneath, causing this magma material to form up at the surface, which is causing this volcano chain. Okay? We can also have an oceanic plate collide with an oceanic plate, and again, we have a similar thing. One plate will sink on another, just depending on who is thicker, which one's more dense. And when that happens, you get that magma to occur again. You get volcanoes to occur on the surface, but because they're not on land, these are now islands that occur. So you get a volcanic island chain. Okay, so this is actually New Zealand, a picture of New Zealand, and New Zealand is a oceanic plate boundary. Okay, these volcanoes that would occur, that's what's making New Zealand. Okay, last of all, we have continental. Okay, so this is when two continental plates converge. And so what happens is instead of one sinking underneath another right away, they're going to kind of push at each other for a long time. And so they're going to kind of compress together like an accordion would. And they're going to make mountain ranges as that happens. You can imagine if you had an accordion stretched out, it's not going to be as thick as when you compress it together. It's going to form ridges at the top. Well, same thing with the two continental plates. You'll have mountain ranges that are forming because the two continental plates are pushing on each other, pushing up each other and kind of crunching up together. And then eventually one of them will sink underneath. But until then, you build this large rippling mountain range. And so if you've ever heard of the Himalayas, okay, which is where Mount Everest is, then the Mount Everest is one of the highest mountains. That is caused by this continental plate boundary. Okay, so the whole Himalaya mountain range is the Indian plate, the country of India, colliding into Nepal area, that plate boundary, and so you get the Himalayan mountains and Mount Everest, and that area is actually still growing. Okay, so I believe this is a picture of the Himalayas, and that area is still growing because the continental plates are still pushing on each other. It's about 2 inches per year or something like that. It's very small, but it is still getting larger and larger over time. Okay, so those are the first three. Okay, that's the first type of plate boundary, convergent, when we get the three different types of plate boundaries for convergent. Let's move on to divergent. Okay, so a divergent plate boundary occurs when two plates are moving away from each other, similar to seafloor spreading. Okay, in this case, you get a lot of volcanic activity because you have magma filling in the gap between where the plates would have been. So Iceland is actually being split apart slowly by the mid-Atlantic ridge because Iceland goes through it. Okay, or the mid-Atlantic ridge goes through Iceland, I should say. And as it separates, that magma material is filling that space, so we get a lot of volcanoes in Iceland. Okay, this bridge on the side right here is actually built across one of those divides. And so slowly over time, they have to rebuild that bridge every couple of years because this gap is getting bigger and bigger as these plates are splitting apart. Okay, and so that's a divergent boundary. And then the last one we want to look at is a transform boundary. Okay, so transform boundaries don't have a lot of mountains or volcanic activity like other boundaries, but they are associated with earthquakes. Okay, so that's when two boundaries are trying to slide, or two plates are trying to slide across each other like this. They're not moving into each other, not moving away. They're just trying to go across each other. Okay, they're kind of switching paths. And when that happens, you just have a lot of pressure building up in certain areas, like this point right here. And so we call this a fault line. And as that pressure builds up, eventually it's going to give in, and the plate will move. And when that happens, you get an earthquake. And so fault lines are known for having lots of earthquakes. So transform boundaries are just that sliding effect, and as certain parts of pressure build up and are given, you get lots of earthquakes. Okay? So there you go. Those are the three types of plate boundaries. Make sure you know those different types and what types of features they are associated with. Okay? And then in class, we played with a simulation on PhET site, and you can do that too. You can kind of put in different plate boundaries and see what happens when you move the different plates. It's kind of fun to see the what occurs. Okay? All right. And again, we watched this video of, it kind of just gives an overview of all the features of plate tectonics. Okay? And then the last thing we talked about is hotspots. Okay? So a hotspot is a phenomenon where you have a spot of volcanic activity that moves underneath the plates. Okay? So it's not associated with a plate boundary. Okay? It's just in the middle of a plate. And this kind of baffled scientists for a long time because they realized that most volcanoes form along plate boundaries, okay, like the Ring of Fire is known for all the different volcanoes, okay, and lots of volcanoes along these plate boundaries, but they couldn't figure out some of these other common ones like Hawaii, Yellowstone, the Galapagos. They were forming in areas that didn't have plate boundaries, and so they couldn't understand why they were forming. But what they realized is that the volcanic activity is just associated with that spot itself, and so there's just kind of a gap in the lithospheric plate, you could say, this hole that has lots of magma material building up in that one area. And when it does, it just kind of reaches the surface and makes an island or a volcano. Okay. And so this can really be seen with Hawaii. Okay. So if you look at Hawaii, the only active volcano on Hawaii is on the Big Island, which is to the southeast. Okay. This is where the hotspot is right now. And as the magma builds up, it's slowly building the island to make it bigger and bigger. Okay, but that hotspot didn't always used to be there because the plate is moving slowly. Okay, so it used to be at Maui and made the island of Maui, and then it used to be at Oahu and made the island of Oahu, and it used to be at the island of Kauai. And so that hotspot has slowly moved, okay, from the northwest to the southeast. And it's not because the hotspot itself is moving. It's staying in the same spot, but the plate is moving across the top of it. Okay, so here's the motion of the Pacific plate. You can imagine if the hot spot was right here at Kauai, and then the plate moved to the northwest, it would appear that the hot spot is moving to the southeast, and so then make the island of Oahu. And then it would appear that the hot spot's moving to the southeast, so make the island of Maui. And then it would appear that the hot spot's moving to the southeast, which would make the island of, or the Big Island is what it's called. Okay. And then it would appear that it will continue to move to the southeast, and eventually you get a new island right here. Okay? So hotspots don't move, or they don't move. The plate is moving across the top of them, so it looks like it's moving. Okay? And then the last application is with Yellowstone. Okay? Old Faithful is actually kind of a volcano itself. The whole park of Yellowstone is pretty much a volcano, and it's a hotspot. The reason Old Faithful goes off is that it has a lot of heat coming from this volcanic activity. And so that hotspot is slowly moving over time as the North American plate is moving over time. Okay, so Old Faithful in a couple, 1,000 or million years isn't going to be Old Faithful anymore. There'll probably be a new geyser, which is at another location that is now or will become the Old Faithful, right? That's the geyser that's going to be reacting. Okay, and so that hotspot again isn't moving, but the plate itself is moving over the top of it. Okay? Well, awesome. That's a basic overview of plate tectonics. So in this video, we talked about the different type of plate boundaries, and we talked about hotspots. Okay, so make sure you know those things. Let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for watching.